Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more.
Lots of locust eaters splits, I offer sweat and splinters. Forest elders breathe their last, I'll bring them for your supper.
Hey y'all, Kelly here, and I'm recording this from Durango, Colorado, where I'm currently at for the fall fruit harvest, and it's been really delightful to enjoy such a wonderful apple and plum year thus far. Although there's so much happening with fruit right now that it's been really hard to get a whole lot done with the apple harvest. Actually, there's autumn olives and plums and apricots still on the trees, and we've found black walnuts even, and gooseberries still ripe. So we're here, and it's in my partner's hometown, so we have a few friends and relatives in the area, and it's a really neat place to start to see fall happen. Although getting settled in post Colorado Trail has been actually a little more difficult than I thought it would be. Walking every day and having a purpose 10 hours a day of like getting to this next spot, and your basic needs of shelter, food, water, rest. It's always a little bit tricky to adjust to life outside of doing something like that. And I know the other people who do big walks also have difficulty with that sometimes. So I've had moments of feeling a little bit overwhelmed by choices and stimulus and options, and sorting through more possessions that I have and more projects. So feeling like getting a little more of a grip on balance and tangling things, and knowing that I can't harvest every apple every day, and getting a space dialed in has been a little tricky too, because we've been staying with some friends and we maybe have to leave that spot for tricky reasons, and we're like, it's just like being able to get grounded in somewhere, given that we have an untraditional situation, I guess, in certain ways, and whatever that really means. I mean, we just don't, I have my camper and we have a bell tent, and we're pretty self-sufficient with that, but we want to be kind of in the world of people and civilization a bit too, and how do you fit in between is kind of always a little tricky. I mean, living nomadically for a while, or just being willing to live off-grid in different ways, it's always a little hard in certain places to figure out how to make it work, especially if you only plan to be there for a little bit. Sometimes it can be tricky, but hopefully we can figure out a way to get a little more rooted into a fall situation. And probably by the time I put this podcast out, we will have figured out something. But at the moment today, as I record this, I'm trying to set with that uncertainty of having to potentially kind of uproot all of my things and routines to move to a different location. And I'm trying to get out of the stress and depression of it and be more open to what the possibilities are bringing in that way. But grateful for the consistency of this podcast and my dedication to putting out 1 to 2, if not 3 episodes per month for y'all to listen to. It really keeps me accountable to have this project ongoing no matter where I am to this work. It's like, you know what, no matter what's happening, you really have to be accountable to this. It also helps me realize okay, if I'm going to continue to hold space for hearing people's stories, or do the work I need to do to kind of connect these people's stories to the worlds that they're involved in, and explore these ideas, I need to have certain things in my life. And so it's something that creates a known at times when things feel a little shuffled. So today I've been working on this episode with Sharon Kallis, which is what you're going to hear coming up. And it was a really sweet delight to talk to her the other day for this episode. Sharon and I met last summer, I think, and it was June or July. It was June at the Saskatoon Circle. It's an ancestral skills gathering that happens in Eastern Washington. And she lives in Canada, but comes down to some of those gatherings that happen in the Pacific Northwest to share her amazing skills with fiber and basketry, cordage, knitting. So we met at that gathering and ended up kind of camping next to each other and hanging out and getting to know each other. And we talked about her work and just discussed the sort of idea of her being on the podcast. And that summer, last summer, which seems like forever ago, we reflect on that in this episode too. Like, gosh, so much has happened since we met. It's been a crazy year. It's been a crazy time in the world for a long time now, but this year has felt intense in a lot of ways. But anyhow, we had this thought that it would be really cool for me to come up and visit her in Vancouver, and I was in northern Idaho last summer for about a month and a half, and I could have probably popped up there after that, but after teaching high attaining for 3 weeks straight, I just had no energy to travel up to Canada and deal with the border, in my camper, and where to park it if I couldn't bring it across the border, and all of it. So I decided to wait on visiting her and her partner David in Vancouver. And even though it would have been really cool to see some of Sharon's projects in real life and be able to potentially document them with photos and follow her around a little bit, but once the pandemic's over and once I feel recharged from so many years of travel, it's definitely on my list to go visit her and see what her world is. So since last summer and that not happening, I really still have kept in mind featuring Sharon and her work on the podcast, because since we became friends or met in real life, I have been following her work online and seeing it more, and I read her book that she gave me last summer too, and I think it's just super cool and unique what she's doing in the city of Vancouver. We finally connected via Zoom this fall when I got back from the Colorado Trail. So here's a bio about Sharon, and it's from the Earth Hand Gleaners Society website, which is an organization she's a part of. Sharon is a community-engaged environmental artist. Actually, that's something she told me on the podcast, is how she defines herself. So I put that in my little write-up about her on my blog, which I'm reading from right now. So with a 1 mile diet approach to sourcing art materials, Sharon works to discover the inherent material potential in a local landscape. Involving community and connecting traditional hand techniques with invasive species, tended plantings, and garden waste, she creates site-specific installations that become ecological interventions. Graduating from Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design in 1996, she began working materials from the land in 1999 and has exhibited and engaged communities with her practice in Ireland, Spain, Mexico, and throughout the United States. At home in Vancouver, Canada, Sharon works with the Vancouver Park Board and Stanley Park Ecology Society. She is one of the primary stewards of the Means of Production Garden since 2009, which is a community garden that grows art materials. She is also one of the primary stewards of Trillium North Park. Sharon has received numerous Canada Council and British Columbia Arts Council grants for both studio-based and community-focused projects. Her work has been acknowledged as the 2010 recipient of the Brandford Elliott International Award for Excellence in Fiber Arts, Vancouver Mayor's Art Award for Studio Design, Emerging Artist, and the Vancouver Mayor's Award recipient for Studio Design in 2017. And her book, Common Threads, Weaving Community Through Collaborative Eco-Art, was published by New Society Publishers in 2014. And is used in many post-secondary programs as a model for creative engagement in shared green spaces. And I personally can attest that her book, Common Threads, is super cool and really inspiring. In this conversation with Sharon, we talk about Sharon's creative work, and how she arrived at what she is doing today in Vancouver, BC, Canada. How creative folks can be important connection makers and ecological problem solvers, and how allowing room for them is very important. We speak to the importance of respecting Indigenous peoples' relationships to their cultural weavings and fiber practices, and Sharon specifically talks to her experience with that in the Pacific Northwest and utilizing plants like cedar and fireweed. How invasive plants can be useful for learning to weave and for problem solving because they are abundant free materials that you can mess up on while experimenting. Different so called invasive plants Sharon has worked with doing community craft projects in Vancouver. The importance of nettles, fireweed, and flax as fiber plants and pollinator preferred species. How weeds are often seen as plants that simply don't serve the human agenda. Navigating connection to place in the land as a settler, and trying to stay buoyant during pandemic, fires, and revolution. Also, with this podcast on the blog, along with a little write-up of Sharon's bio and how I met her and just a little general overview of our connection, I put a few YouTube videos of her demonstrating different things over the years, or like talking about different materials and whatnot. They're linked there, and in the show notes as well for this episode you can also find a link to her Instagram, Facebook page, the Earth Hen Gleaners Society website, which is an organization that she's a part of, a link to her book, and a little bit more. And as well, in celebration of this episode, Sharon offered for patrons of the podcast to do a little fiber processing video, and we're going to post that pretty soon after this release. And I'm excited about that. She's really a great teacher and knows a lot about processing fiber, so I'm excited that we have something to share with people who are supporting the Ground Shots podcast. And you can find the Patreon page for this project at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, and the link for that is always in the show notes and always on our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com, and that's OFSEDGEANDSALT.com. So with that, let's go ahead and get to this conversation with Sharon. We start off just by talking casually, and then we move into more of an interview where I'm asking her specifically about her work. So let's go ahead and get to this convo. Happy listening, y'all.
Logs of locust cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinters.
Normally I'm very buoyant, which is a good thing and allows me to do the work I'm doing. That I think it's just, sometimes being bullheaded and buoyant that allows me to keep going forward when others would give up. But anyway, all of that is really being tested, and it's the air quality here is so poor right now. Like, I had 4 days where I just couldn't open my door at all, which puts me in a concrete shoebox that's 500 square feet as my live workspace. And, I have a balcony that's really large and is covered. So that's actually been my workspace since March through all of this. And then, of course, we've got the 2 parks that I work out of. So I've been really privileged through all of the pandemic of having these gardens to be tending and an outdoor workspace that's private to be in, and all of that was just kind of taken away. And you realize how much air quality is something, when you have it, you take it for granted. It's kind of like when my back isn't sore, I just take having a healthy back for granted. And now suddenly not having that air quality is, it's a wake-up call. And certainly through the pandemic of having, everything then reduced that much more in what's possible, being able to just be emotionally dysfunctional is that much harder, right? Our capacity is just tested. Anyway, so now I've taken to every time I pour myself a glass of water, I'm just giving gratitude to the fact that I have potable water and hot water on demand by turning a faucet, because we take that for granted here, and we shouldn't, because not everybody has that. So yeah, anyway, it's hard. It's hard times.
It puts everything
Yeah.
in perspective. I'm in Colorado right now, and it's a little smoky today, but I was on the Colorado Trail all summer, and we had a week or two where up in the high country you couldn't see the see that far. It was pretty smoky, but it still was nothing compared to, like, I don't know why it just isn't. We had a bunch of fires here, and then this big snowstorm knocked everything out, which was great, but yeah, it hasn't been unbearable. And I've experienced that, like, one time actually in Hood River at our mutual friend Aaron's place. There was a fire like right down the canyon, like the gorge from there a couple years ago, and I was at her cabin, and we were like inside her cabin, like, what do we do? It's so smoky, it's terrible. So yeah, I had never experienced that until then, and then I felt all anxious, and I realized that smoke does that too, you know.
Yeah, and it's interesting because all through the pandemic, there has been this kind of heaviness and this, existential weight, shall we say, that I and many others have been kind of feeling in a intellectual and an emotional way. And now suddenly I'm feeling that as well on a physical level. Like it's interesting trying to have that. How do you kind of tease out what you're feeling? What is actually the physical response and what is the emotional response to what's happening? And then of course it's like, I'm coughing, my throat is sore, my nose is stuffed up. Do I have COVID, right? Like there's that whole other kind of, which, oh my God. Yeah. So anyway, here we are. Yeah.
Cultural anxiety on top of physiological
Yes.
anxiety, and then more.
Yeah. It's just like what's next, and it's that like, yeah. Like I have been getting the New York Times, subscribed to the New York Times a year and a half ago, I guess, when things stateside started to really go off track, as we predicted with your current government. And so I've just, I've been like way more of an American news junkie than I really want to be. And myself and so many others that I know in the UK, throughout Canada, are like, when is he going to be gone so we can have those 2 or 3 hours of our lives back of where we're paying attention to what's happening in your government? Anyway, it's like waking up and not being able to stop myself. It's like this bad compulsion now, this bad relationship that I keep going back for more, and those notices keep coming into my inbox.
Like, what did he do today?
And I keep clicking and reading, and it's like, why am I still doing this to myself? Anyway, so I have taken to having a couple of days a week where I just don't allow myself to read the news, and I don't go on social media, and I just kind of present in my own world and with the people I see on that day and my friends, whatever. But it's like no social media, no news. But yeah, it is this kind of weird dysfunctional obsessive relationship that is not good. But but at the other hand, it's like I feel this need to stay somewhat informed of what's going on. But yeah, how do you do that and then still function within your own life is kind of the juggle, isn't it?
Yeah. Spring, when the pandemic hit, I was in rural New Mexico, basically in the wilderness, and there was no cell service unless I went to town. Silver City was the closest town, and so I would do that one day a week. And it was kind of crazy. Yeah. It was like, or I had to bike up this mountain, and I would get 2 bars, but I had to work to get to that spot, and I would always feel really crappy at the end of that day, and then I had another 5 or 6 days until the next time, and I really noticed how I felt like that anxiety I was observing other people have, like on overdrive, I was just having more like 1 or 2 days a week instead of every day, all day. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and trying to just kind of keep that in check somehow. And it's the conversation each of us has to have with ourselves in terms of what does the most good, how much can we take in and still function and be positive and be supportive in our own immediate worlds where we're more able to make a difference and support others. And yeah, a friend that I work with, Lori Snyder, who is a herbalist and a amazing skill holder, Métis background. She and I were talking about this, and she was like, Sharon, don't beat yourself up for unplugging. I've had conversations with elders that I talk with who have said to me, absolutely, it's important that there are people out there that are able to stay buoyant and uplift and hold that space for others. And if being unplugged from that daily grind is what allows it, then that's what you need to do. But maintaining buoyancy is super important at times like this.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something for that. And I think each of us has to answer for ourselves what is our best place to be in terms of the multiple calls to action that are required right now. And there are multiple ways of responding and being present and supportive and helpful, whether you are a frontline worker, whether you are a frontline protester, whether you are keeping your head down and just doing good work that's supporting others. Yeah, there's multiple ways that we can be on the side of good, right? Be kind of, yeah, I don't know. I could start crying now though as I think about it. Anyway, but we each have to have that conversation for ourselves of what can we do, and it's going to be different for everyone. Yeah.
I mean, I think about like if I was physically, but maybe back in Virginia where I grew up, I would probably would have been more involved in like protests with the Confederate statues and things like that. But like right now I'm in rural Colorado. There's like a different set of fields that I can touch here, and then I have
Yeah.
this project which is much more like everywhere. It can reach everywhere, but I can still be where I am.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to drop everything right this second and go to Virginia and like do that. I don't think I can energetically right now.
Yeah.
But in this place, I can continue to do what I've been doing. I did a podcast actually a couple years ago about why the statues should go down, or at least it was like a conversation, a big part of the conversation I had with a friend of mine. It's like, okay, well, like I'm doing what I can where I am with what I have, and that was a awakening, realizing I can't be everywhere and do everything and hold it all because I'm not the kind of person that has that endless energy. So we all just like, we have our gifts and we have to figure out how to continue to like trust in that,
Exactly.
Well, I want you to introduce the audience to a little bit of your art practice because you're an artist and a crafts person, and then also speak a little bit about how you mix art and craft because I think that's really interesting. A lot of people keep that as separate worlds. At least I've noticed that in my own dabbling in like the art world and the craft world, and I really like how you kind of do a lot of things that merge that. So introduce yourself and your work and then how you merge those worlds together in your work.
Sure. My name is Sharon Kallis, and I'm here in the place we call Vancouver, British Columbia, and I live on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people, and it is in the Coast Salish language basin. And I've been here since '92. I grew up in Ontario and moved out for art school to go to Emily Carr in 1992. So I've been out here quite a while now. This is definitely home. My background is coming from many generations, Canadian settlers, coming from Wales and Scotland and Ireland and Germany, England. And my family, over multiple generations, back to like, you know, loyalists that were given land in New Brunswick because it was cheaper than sending them back to Britain after the American War of Independence. So my family has moved from one province to another province, or state to another state or province, mostly through Canada. So I don't have a strong sense of connection to place beyond the family home where I grew up in suburbs, very middle class, suburban lifestyle in a very white community. And moving out here, I was really struck, if I think back to when I first moved out here, I was really struck by how many people that I saw out here that were not white, which was actually a really interesting. I remember being on a bus and having this sense of relief, looking around at how many people there were with different skin colors to myself and different clothing. And it was just this very multicultural experience that I looked around, and it was like, oh, like I remember sighing, like it felt right. It felt somehow there was a balance. Just being on this public bus going from Richmond, where I was living at the time, to school one morning, but also seeing so many Indigenous people on the streets and around, which you did not see at all in the city that I grew up. And, you know, growing up in school, we learned about First Nations, and it was this kind of past tense story that we were told. And it was a really interesting reframing for me to learn what unceded even meant. The fact that I'm living on land that the peoples whose land we're on, they never signed anything. This is not a treated area. So that was something that was new to me. So there were just all kinds of discoveries that I started kind of making and really changing the story for me about my own family history, my own sense of place and connection to that place, and just trying to kind of unpack where I fit into all of that. And I didn't, you know, it's still hard to kind of find words to that to an extent. I certainly didn't have the language to put to it at the time. And that would have been, you know, I was in my early 20s. But yeah, so I went to art school and graduated from art school in '96, and I didn't have a lot of money. I'd managed to put myself through art school without student loans. And so I graduated debt-free, which was massive. And I was very clear on the fact I did not want to be a commercial artist. I didn't have any interest as I didn't identify as a consumer, and so I didn't feel like it made sense to be creating artwork that fit within a consumptive system. And I didn't really know what all that meant. I was just very clear on what I didn't want to be without necessarily knowing what the alternative was. But I understood enough to know the economics of the fact that if I was not going to sell the work I was making, there was no logistical or economic feasibility in buying the materials that I was going to be using in that art practice. So I just felt like it was really important to start looking at what was free and how could I obsessively and compulsively change things that I was finding in my world for free and make beautiful and interesting things. And when art school in the early 90s, the handmade aesthetic was really out of fashion. It was verboten. And so I basically spent that 4 years at Emily Carr having to justify the existence of my hand in the work I was making. And, you know, yeah, I called it my conceptual boot camp. It was kind of like going to school. And I'd come from this really incredible high school that I went to, HB Beale in London, Ontario, which was a technical vocational high school. So I'd had 3 years of really fantastic base training in 12 different studio areas, from textiles and jewelry and metalwork and film and animation and lithography and etching and high school. This was high school. So it's a high school, and all of our materials were basically free, like drawers and drawers of Stonehenge paper that were free. And I got bus tickets to go to the school that was downtown because I was taking a program that was not offered in my local high school. So it was awesome. And the program is still around, and it came from this time. The school, I think, was started in 1912, where the arts were seen as a vocation. So this was kind of a school, it's a big school for students who were not going to be going onto an academic track or be pursuing college or university. So it was an opportunity to get your foot in the door on a trade before you graduated. And so people were doing like air conditioning and auto body, or, you know, learning nursing aids or hairdressing. Like all of that was kind of a part of it. So you would do half a day academics and then half a day in whatever your area of study was. And they had this incredible arts program. And so I did regular high school for 3 years, and I sucked at it. My counselor looked at my kind of file, and he was like, you know, you need 9 art credits to graduate. You've got 33. I'm not supposed to recommend you go to another school, but you might want to look at the school Beal. So anyway, that was how I got into Beal, which had this fantastic kind of craft-based understanding and training, but didn't, you know, we had art history every week. We had live nude models once a week and studied, like, after doing 6 weeks of anatomy. But it didn't get into a lot of conceptual work or that kind of being able to think and write about what you were making. That wasn't the focus at that point, maybe now. Anyway, so when I arrived at Emily Carr, I had really strong foundational skills in the making, having come from textiles and ceramics, but I didn't have the strong conceptual. So Emily Carr was hard as hell for me, but it also gave me the skills to be able to justify doing what I want to do from the handmade craft aesthetic. I could put that into the art speak, which is probably the best thing that Emily Carr did for me. Anyway, I spent a lot of time on that. So that was my kind of background training when I came out here, and I knew I didn't want to be a commercial artist. So what did that mean? And I was working large scale, wanting to work large scale, and ceramics had been my focus when I was at Emily Carr. And I got really frustrated with the whole craft art dialogue. It just like bored me to tears. And so I always just kind of felt like I was on the outside, like I was an outsider. I was kind of an outsider artist, working on the fringe. I didn't, you know, environmental art wasn't a big thing at that point. People knew about Andy Goldsworthy's work, but that was, you know, that was kind of Agnes Denes. You know, there were a few kind of trailblazers that we learned about and studied, but I found a green waste pile in the morning walks down to the dog park of my local park. And I noticed that this is where the gardeners seemed to always be leaving all the clippings of branches, etc., from the grounds work that she was doing. And then once a week, that pile would disappear. And so I just started kind of poking at that pile of sticks and had this attitude of like, enough of anything can be made into something. And then what is that something? And that journey of inquiry was what really stoked and excited me. And that got me really kind of, essentially, I guess, returning to my textile roots, although I'd never done any basketry. And I kind of lament that I wasn't introduced to basketry sooner. I kind of fumbled my way through with the sticks, kind of teaching me what they would do and wouldn't do, or whatever the plants were that I was finding in the waste pile. And then I had this other revolution, or epiphany, I guess is a better word, where I had a foster dog that I had just adopted who was like this big shaggy beast, and she shed like a Pomeranian size amount of fur every day. I was sweeping up from this tiny little apartment. And I was just like, oh my God, this is driving me nuts. Like every time I turn around, there are these tumbleweeds of masses of gray fur floating across the floor. I'm constantly sweeping. And I had this memory, this kind of trigger of like, oh, this is slut's wool. This notion that, you know, slut's wool, this old term, original term of slut is to be unclean. And this idea of like, you know, what gathers under your bed is slut's wool. And it was like, wool. Well, I have a spinning wheel down in storage from my days as a teenager spinning. I pull out my spinning wheel and see if I can spin this floor sweeping. And so spinning that floor sweeping gave me suddenly this interest in sweeping, where instead of I have to sweep, and this really sucks, it's this never ending work, it became a harvest. It became this exciting moment of, oh, I get to sweep. Like what the dog is dropping on the floor is actually a gift. This is something that is a resource if I just change how I think about it. And that was this like mind-blowing, expansive moment for me of recognizing that huge opportunity. And, you know, we live in this way of constantly this duality of things that are good, things that are not, things that we want, things that we don't, what's garbage, what's green waste. All of that are these kind of new, kind of post-industrial terms where really we used to use everything we had. And so getting back to this notion that, you know, when I go out and I do some gardening now, it's an opportunity to be gathering for materials. If I'm participating in an invasive species removal, what are those materials? What can be done with those? And it's not this like onerous task that has to be done. It's an opportunity for something else to happen. And being able to kind of approach that daily drudgery work that's involved in taking care of a home or taking care of a garden, tending any landscape, if we can shift our thinking to, well, what's being provided here and what are the skills or what are the tools that are required to utilize this gift that's being offered up. So that is kind of the kind of bigger zeitgeist of where my work has landed, is looking for those opportunities and bringing community in to participate in that process and in that learning. Yeah, so what was your question again? Did I introduce myself there?
You nailed it. It's inspiring to hear you talk about how you landed to where you are. I mean, also it's inspiring to just look at your Instagram, to like look at your blog, like you have like a Flickr and your blogs. I went and did that yesterday to just,
oh my God,
look at visuals of your work. Also,
yeah,
seeing it in person too, the cool
yeah,
things that you make. But because I've definitely dabbled in that reality a few times, but then I maybe living on the road, it's a little hard sometimes to gather large amounts of things within space. But when I lived in North Carolina, it just it reminds me of times in my life where I was like thinking that way, and it's inspiring me to try to figure out how to do that again, no matter where I live. But living in North Carolina, we had to do a lot of clearing of like honeysuckle and privet and
do you have kudzu down that way?
Kudzu, yeah.
Kudzu, yeah.
I worked for an herbalist who had kudzu growing on the outside of her property, like where it literally every week when I get there, it had already grown like 3 feet back into the garden. So I would clear it every week, the edge, you know.
Wow, yeah.
And all of those plants are great for basketry or weaving or fiber in different ways, depending on how they are, you know. And
yeah, totally.
Especially is really cool to see a culture of weaving kind of emerging out of that plant.
Well, and not just emerging, when you look at the tradition, Japanese textiles, you know, kimonos were made with kudzu. It is a beautiful fiber, and it's, you know, obviously this is a plant that is out of place. It was not intended to be where it is, but there's no getting rid of it now. It's abundant. And so how do you utilize that, right? And what's that piece that you can look at of where tending the land actually creates a business opportunity, a skills development opportunity. It's like looking at places through the states that have weld as, not weld, woad as an invasive species. And it's like, well, it's there because there used to be a textile industry here that was using it. And it's that disconnect. We've lost that relationship to the plant now. But, you know, the plant was brought here for a purpose. So why can't we get that going again? And I know that's a really, really simplistic answer. There's all kinds of challenges there, but still, I think the question is worth posing. Why can't we have kudzu shirts that are dyed with woad?
I think culture is a huge part of it. My partner and I used to do a lot of these botanical research projects, and I'm trying to get back into doing that, where I like do a big write up and like photography and like just like really experiment with certain plants. And we've been playing around with Russian olive, which is a so-called invasive plant.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is demonized. It's in the West, and then autumn olive is a relative that's a lot in the East. But I think they both kind of come together at different. I don't know about Canada. I think probably autumn olive and Russian olive probably come into Canada too. And then there's native species that are like relatives too. But just that in the Middle East, Russian olive is like a really revered food and medicine plant. And we're like finding all of this cool stuff about in Turkey and like Egypt and all these places where like people are like they love that plant, you know. And like here, I think a lot of people don't even know. They think it has no use. It's not edible. It's only bad. And I'm like, well, again, I know that I know we're moving into that conversation about invasive plants and how we can like look at them differently. I know that a lot of these we really can't eradicate. I mean, I know people want to try, but if we use them and integrate them into our culture, I mean, we don't really know what they're going to do in 100, 200 years too. They might find them, you know?
And, you know, I feel, so I practice many things and I am a master of nothing. And I'm always very clear about that. When I'm talking with weavers, I always introduce myself as somebody who practices weaving, but I am not a weaver. Like for a willow weaver, somebody to look at my work, that I'm not going to pass any tests in terms of the caliber of my weaving. And likewise within stewardship and land tending practices, permaculture, you know, I dip my toes into those areas, and I know just enough to kind of be engaged and potentially get myself into trouble, as some would say. But there's this separation. Like humans just like to think we're above and outside of nature and controlling nature, and that is so problematic in how it manifests in our day-to-day actions and in decision making, where we don't recognize that humans have been keeping these species in check for thousands of years. There is this relationship. Like this is how the plants are supposed, and the animals, right? This is the interconnectedness. And when we have industrialized and separated ourselves out from the system to the extent that we have, this is where I feel a lot of those problems end up coming from, is because the humans aren't involved and aren't using those materials anymore. They're maybe going to Home Depot and buying plastic Tupperware instead of weaving a basket with whatever they've got in their backyard, right? Like if we can put ourselves back into the system, if we can imagine ourselves back into that human ecosystem in fulfilling our daily needs, then there is a place that allows for those species that would otherwise be too vigorous and outcompete other species to be kept in check and to be used in a appropriate and respectful way. That and I think that's kind of a big part of what work I do, is just kind of pose those questions and keep my eyes open for those opportunities, and then bring other people in to work in that process, and kind of learn and discover and share together. So that's you know, within the city, that's a big part of what we're doing.
And I have your book that you gave me last summer when we Saskatoon, and I'm looking at it right now. It's really cool.
God, last June. Doesn't that feel like a decade ago now? Oh my God. That's been 14 months and it could be 14 years. Seriously, what a
So
different place we're in now.
yeah, totally. Um, you in this book, I mean, and this was, I don't know, what year was this put out? 2014.
2014.
So you probably have done a lot and a lot of
I
things.
wrote it 2014, I think. Was it published 2015? I think it came out November 2014.
Yeah, that's what it says here. So I'm sure you have a lot of other things you've been doing since then. But in this book, I think it's really cool how you document kind of like the intention behind some of your projects in the city of Vancouver, right? That's where you are.
Yeah, yeah,
And using so-called invasive species. I say so-called because sometimes I even question the
yeah,
concept of invasive, but we won't go there in this
right.
conversation. But um, using these abundant invasive species in the city to do remediation projects or to do like big sculptural projects that beautify places or
Yeah,
I find that so cool, and I liked how you documented that, and then you like had a whole how-to section of like, well, here's how you can actually do it, yourself wherever you live.
yeah,
So
yeah.
maybe you could speak a little bit about like the different plants that you've been working with in the city
Sure.
and
Yeah,
how you work with them.
I don't do as much work with invasives as I used to. I kind of jump in and work with the Stanley Park Ecology Society occasionally, and I get pulled in to kind of consult and such on projects. But a big part for me of working with the invasives came about when I was working with Todd DeVries, who is a Haida cedar weaver. In 2012, I think we did this project called the Urban Weaver Project. And one of the things that Todd was talking about, as somebody who is not living within his community in Haida Gwaii, but is here in the city, is, how do you access cedar bark and the challenge of that? And, there just aren't enough cedar trees for everybody who wants to weave, period, never mind or people who are culturally connected to working with cedar, never mind everybody who just wants to have that West Coast weaving experience of working with cedar. So this notion of looking at when I met Todd, I was doing a lot of work with English ivy and with Himalayan blackberry, a little bit with holly and yellow flag iris. And I was just kind of muddling my way through learning techniques on my own and, learning from the plants essentially and applying that base core knowledge I had from my early textile training of, weaving over, under, and just kind of taking that into my own style of random baskets and random weaving and crocheting, whatever. But when I met Todd, I really was wanting to meet somebody who actually had some weaving chops, who knew what they were working with, knew what they were doing. And so this kind of material challenge that we talked about of like, what do you do in the city? Where do you go? And that notion of where invasive species can really kind of bridge that gap of material access, regardless of what culture you come from. It can be something that is plentiful and allow that introductory place to learning what it's like to work with a living or real material versus kind of what I think of as being dead materials, the kind of commercially processed, like if you go and you buy that reed or that whatever it is at Michael's or craft shops where everything is kind of the same width and the same thickness, and it's, you may as well be working with cardboard for all the life that is in that material. And so, yeah, working with ivy, it just became that opportunity to recognize how in many ways it is similar to spruce roots, for instance. It's very different, but it also has a lot of similarities, and you can do a lot of the same techniques. It's great for twining. And that notion of, for me, being able to teach people without having to have precious materials so that you can make mistakes and you can try things and not be intimidated, not have that same, like the pressure of a clean, pristine white page that you're afraid to make a line on. How can you learn and explore and experiment with these materials that are really abundant and there for use? And then how do you do that safely? What are your disposal? What are things you have to make sure you're not starting ivy patches in places that they weren't before, comes into it. But it really solidified for me that, you know, materials like cedar bark and spruce roots, those are very precious, precious materials that, regardless of what culture you're coming from, I feel you need to put your weaving time in on the materials that are available and get your chops up before you are worthy to meet those other materials. And then when you are looking at cedar bark in particular, what is your cultural tradition to that material? Do you have a cultural ancestral tradition to that material? And I have woven with cedar. I have gone with my friend Tracy and Delmar Williams, who are from the Squamish Nation, have taken me out to harvest cedar bark with them. But it is certainly never something I would teach others or weave with and sell something made out of cedar weaving, made out of cedar. I encourage others to leave those plants and leave those materials for those that need them, because there is a real place for them. And I often remember Tracy, at the time I was working with Todd on this, saying, you know, I can't weave with ivy because the work, or blackberry, the work I'm doing is creating cultural regalia. And those plants weren't here when my ancestors were walking. My ancestors aren't connected to those plants. Those plants don't speak to my ancestors. And that really hit home for me, the importance of keeping those plants protected and available for those that need them to do that important work. And so for me, a part of the working with invasive species becomes, how are we tending those areas where we are actually supporting the plants that we want to have there. So for instance, removing yellow flag iris so that there is more room for the species that would be in the riparian areas, whether they're the tules or scirpus species, but the plants that are doing that work and need to be there and are otherwise choked out by the invasives. So how can we remove the invasives to keep that space for the other plants? So most of my work now, that book came out when Trillium North Park was just being developed. And most of my work now is really tending the plants at both Means of Production Garden and Trillium Garden, where we grow plants for traditional hand uses. And the plants that were chosen at Trillium were primarily looking at plants that have been used traditionally by First Nations from around the province of British Columbia. So it's a little bit wider than just necessarily coastal, which makes sense from a climate change perspective, that we're much more like Kelowna or the interior than we were here 100 years ago. And also kind of getting beyond the kind of classic kind of 12 plants that every urban native garden is supposed to have. So planting fireweed and planting dogbane have been two of the species that it's taken me 6 years really to get those plants established and happening in the gardens. There's been multiple stories about why it took so long, but so those are two plants that I haven't got as much of a working relationship or understanding of using, because my time has always been protecting those plants and harvesting invasives around them if I was in other places, and then trying to be their advocate, if you will, and get them established here in the city, in an area that can be tended and worked, and bring that relationship back to, well, what is the season of fireweed? When do we harvest medicine for tea? When do we harvest the fluff? When do we harvest the bark? How are, what's going on with the fireweed? So I'm figuring all that out at this point.
I'm glad you brought that point up about like culturally significant plants, and just there's a dynamic to that it's different everywhere you are, and I don't know, sometimes like that it's not so clear always. Cedar feels like a really
Yeah.
clear
It's
example.
obvious.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all know. I mean, not we don't all know, but many people who spent time in the Pacific Northwest know that the logging practices and the practices of like how the land's being used has made the cedar populations dwindle, and therefore also the ability for indigenous peoples to harvest their bark is
Hmm.
less, right? That those
Yeah.
trees don't bounce back as the same as other conifers or other trees
Yeah.
in the forest.
Yeah.
They need certain conditions. But like I've been thinking about this a lot because I had this conversation with, I don't know if you know Aganok, who's a weaver, who sometimes
Yeah.
listens to
Yeah.
these gatherings. She
Yeah.
was on the podcast a couple years ago and talked a little bit about like having consciousness, for folks to have consciousness around like using certain materials in their craft practice, right? Not to say that you should and you shouldn't, clearly,
Hmm.
but like
Hmm.
consciousness around that. And then last year, or this actually was earlier this year, it feels like last year, but I did a episode on wild tending on the podcast. And wild tending requires harvesting sometimes. Sometimes it's just about seed dispersal or divisions or whatever, like these practices that humans can have on the land that can benefit and like increase diversity or abundance, right? And willow is a plant that is obviously used in weaving, in the western Turtle Island, Canada, right? There's willow in Canada, right?
Oh,
And
for sure. Yeah.
in the U.S. And then it also was a European weaving material too.
Hmm. Hmm.
But someone put a comment on that episode saying like, where I live in Northern California, the indigenous peoples would prefer us ask before we harvest willow on in certain areas. And even though it's a European ancestor, there's traditions of weaving in Europe. It's really specific to that place in those patches being traditionally tended, and like there's no clear like you should or shouldn't weave with it. It's just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not sure what I'm trying to say or ask, other than like it sparked my thought process, because you can't always ask indigenous peoples in certain places,
It's hard. It's yeah. And Cease Weiss, a woman I have great respect for. She's known as the plant diva. She is Squamish Nation, um, and talks about the importance of asking the nation whose territory you're on. But yes, that's hard, that's complex, because who do you ask? And just because you know somebody that is of that nation, the assumption that they are going to feel the capacity to be the person that gives, right? Like, what does that look like? And I think about that a lot, because weird circuitous route that has placed me at the age of 51 as this white woman living well below the poverty line with all of this downtown urban land, gardens, like a couple of hectares. I don't know, I suck at scale, so I'm never good at holding that. But that I somehow am the kind of key holder to all of these plants that are growing, and all of this, like that I, where there are people whose territory I am working on who would have had the ancestral rights to that place and would have been those key holders or gatekeepers, or whatever term you want to put to it, that would have been basically the um, the stewards or the tenders that were witnessing what was happening to the land, what was happening to the plants and the animals, and saying to people that asked them, yes, you can harvest that, it's a good year, or no, I've already had 10 people come in and harvest, no, it's actually those plants aren't doing well, or the fish didn't return as strong, right? Like that ongoing, long durational, inherited place of responsibility to tend and observe and witness a place. And that system existed, and it was destroyed with colonization. And so now what has that left us with? It's left us with this broken system where we don't know what those records are. We don't know who those people are. It's highly political. It's super, super charged. Here in Vancouver, we have 3 nations whose land this Vancouver area is. And within the nations, there is conflict of whose area is whose. So even from the city and municipal perspective of who they have to negotiate with or who they're approaching, they can't go to one nation, they have to go to all 3 nations. And the assumption that all 3 nations are going to be able to agree, it's super challenging. Like it's way beyond my capacity to try and sort out and hold. But all I know is that for various reasons, I have ended up in this place of kind of tending and being the primary person that is currently being witness to the land and the plants and the seasonal changes and how those plants are doing. And I'm the one that people come to and make those requests of, which is kind of weird and icky at times when I really kind of allow myself to think too deeply about it. I try my best to be a good ally and make connections wherever possible, create openings and opportunities for people that are either our local 3 nations or other Aboriginal, Indigenous Aboriginal people that are living in the city that are needing to make medicine, are needing a particular wood for a project, whatever, that I can be an ally for them and make that material access possible, as well as the skill sharing and kind of free placement in classes or, you know, whatever, connecting people. So I just try as much as possible to be a good ally and to be a bridge and to let that kind of flow through what I'm doing and what I'm holding.
Yeah. It's really complex. And where we are in Colorado is traditional Ute land, and we've thought about that, like, okay, so say we want to harvest some dog bane, I don't know, like from the riverside, like, should we go ask the Ute tribe? We actually don't know anyone really in the tribe to harvest dog bane. Like, would they think we're ridiculous for asking? Maybe they don't even really know much about the dog bane here.
Yeah.
It's different everywhere. And then where I'm from in Virginia, there's not like colonization happened so much longer ago. There are hardly any reservations. Not that reservations are always a good thing, but like there isn't, the Cherokee have a reservation, but like there's not a lot of indigenous sovereignty and presence on the land. And so it's not to ask if I can harvest hickory nuts or something. It's just like there's no one to really ask, and they may not even have a connection to that anymore because it's been so long and severed so long. So it's just not to say that we shouldn't try, you know, of course, to navigate.
So how do you reconcile that, right? What are simple, small, as well as big things that we as individuals can each take on that perhaps make things better? Whether it is, for me, the biggie that I just come back to is, how do I take care of the plants? How do I be a good ally to the plants? And how do I support the plants? How do I increase the plants? How do I spread and give as many people as are game to plant nettle seeds? How do I get nettle seeds out there to the greater good, and fireweed? And how do I, you know, shift how parks thinks about what plants are actually deserving in park space? That's a big part of kind of what I find myself doing, is just trying to change that older school sensibility of what plants belong in parks and how we use parks. But sometimes it's easier because those strong relationships with the plants, like that's my immediate relationship. I have friends within the Squamish Nation that I can go to and have conversations with and ask, but ultimately, for me personally, in my day-to-day work, it's the plants. And if I'm supporting those plants, then there is this trickle effect where that is going to impact and potentially aid First Nations people who are wanting access to those plants. So it's maybe a step or two steps removed, but I feel like there is a way there that is easier for me to identify and to kind of address and act on. So, you know, if you are not able to ask somebody permission when you're going to harvest those nuts, can you be doing whatever you can to plant nuts in other places that are going to be perhaps close to the reservations or in other places where people will be able to access for more nuts 20 or 30 years from now? Can you be giving some of the nuts that you're harvesting to people that you meet that don't have the capacity themselves to get out and harvest and gather? And so, you know, and that's for me, like when I'm harvesting fiber or whatever, what fibers am I giving away? How am I supporting other people's process and journey? So it always, for me, it just comes back to the plants, because that is a piece that doesn't feel political. That doesn't feel as emotionally loaded is a weird word to use, but I'm lacking a different way of putting it. And anyway, it's simple, right? If I tend the plants, if I take care of the plants, if I increase the plants that are of this place, that belong in this place, and if I can plant more fireweed and stinging nettle everywhere I go, then perhaps I will leave a little pocket of the city in better shape than I found it. I don't know, it's so basic, it feels like nothing, and yet sometimes it feels so overwhelming.
Have you, since the park, so you've been able to plant nettles in parks? I know that's probably
Oh my
something.
God, yeah, so don't tell anyone. So yeah, and so it's interesting. I keep waiting for when I'm going to get the calls from Park Board that there have been complaints about the amount of nettles that I've got growing in city parks, and that call hasn't come yet. But I can tell you it was an interesting thing getting fireweed growing, because fireweed is seen as a weed that, you know, even its common name that we all call it, fireweed, has got weed embedded in the name. And I think what it comes down to is, you know, when you break down how people see invasive plants, it's complicated. And again, it's like that. Everything is on a scale, or, you know, there's this gradient, and people think of invasive plants as being plants that are from elsewhere, but actually invasive plants can be plants that belong in a place, but they don't fit the human agenda for that land. That's essentially, right? If we just kind of cut through the chase, that's what we call an invasive species. And so fireweed is seen as an invasive, as I understand it, in gardens, because it speaks to a place being untended. It's like dandelions. For years, I would do nothing but remove dandelions, because if there weren't dandelions, and if I put up a nice woven fence and I took out the dandelions, people would see a place as somehow intentional, even if it didn't look like what they thought a garden should look like. They wouldn't complain because it looked tended. But dandelions and fireweed are both species that people have forever seen as being weeds, and therefore, you know, ergo garden untended. So trying to get past that, and it's been great this past few years, you know, pollination has become such a hot topic now. Everybody is aware of how, well, most people are aware that dandelions are an early feeder for bees and how important they are, which is great. So now it's like, save the dandelions, all the good things that dandelions can do, and same with fireweed. But the park board operations here did not want to see fireweed in the general garden bed area, you know, and garden beds is a glamorous term, but really it's just like a planted zone that's not lawn is a better way. That's what I mean when I say gardens. And what we came down to through various conversations was that a raised bed was fine. And so we have this raised bed at Trillium that is probably about 30 okay, if I look at it from my apartment to give a scale, it's probably about 30 feet by 18 feet, and it's almost yeah, anyway, and it's not a square bed, but there's a lot of dogbane and fireweed that the Park Board Operations Nursery actually started for me. I gave them the seeds, and they started, 240 fireweed seedlings, and I think about 40 dogbane. And with the fireweed being in this raised bed, there is this psychological relief that somehow it's a tended area that is raised above or separated from if the fireweed was just in amongst the willow and the nettle. Anyway, so there's a little takeaway for everybody that's trying to negotiate with an operations or a city system. Raised beds are separate. Yeah, so once we figured that out, it's great. So I have all this fireweed that I'm very conscious of making sure I get some people out there to harvest the fluff once the seeds open up before we are seeding the entire neighborhood. We do, there is a lot of seed that does distribute because there's a lot of blowaway, but it's so beautiful. And it's just such a gorgeous plant and everybody loves it. And yeah, and there's all these nettles that are in the park as well that I don't know how they got there. I certainly didn't seed them, Kelly. I'm not sure where the nettle came from, but yes, there's lots of it. And we actually had, I will never admit to anything, park board team that was working on or is working on urban pollinator projects came around. I saw one day, this was in the springtime, maybe this was last year. It must have been pre-COVID. It's in the before. Anyway, I noticed when I was working that there was like 3 or 4 people with clipboards walking around looking in the garden. It was like, who are those people? And I went over and I knew one of them was somebody I've worked with before, and they were just doing a survey of all of the urban pollinator projects that had been started in the city in the last 4 or 5 years to just see where things were at. And it was in May and all the lupins were out and the place was beautiful and it was just literally humming with activity. And one of the people made the comment, they were like, oh man, this is the best you have got, this is the best results we've seen for a pollinator zone really functioning and working. And I pointed at the nettle. It's like, well, there's all these things that we know nettle is great for supporting its neighboring plants, for how it is providing habitat. I've taken so many videos of ladybug porn, as I call it, of the ladybugs just humping away on the little nettle leaves. It's awesome. So anyway, the nettle is really doing wondrous things for what is otherwise kind of an industrialized, post-industrial wasteland that was replanted 5 or 6 years ago. And it's messy. It doesn't look like a beautiful tended garden, but there is, the fireweed, the dogbane. I've got lots of tea plants in there as well. Lots of nettle and lupins, yarrow. There's snowberry bushes. There's lots of Nootka rose. So, there's lots of species, and then there's some trees that are starting to develop. But being able to get Park Board working with us, and Vancouver's very unique. I think there's only 2 cities in North America. The other one is somewhere stateside that has a park board that is separate from our city council. We actually have 2 elected. So we have kind of park board commissioners as well as a city council. And then within the park board team, we have the ACE team, Arts, Culture, and Engagement. And it is a staff of about 8 people that work with Park Board in placing artists in communities and in city parks and in community centers that are, professional community engaged artists that are engaging the community in their arts practice. And there is a real push within that for environmental art. So I've been really, really lucky and had my practice incredibly supported by this arts, culture, and engagement team to make the work that I'm doing possible
A
within the city parks.
lot of cities don't have that.
No. So, that has been really, those are my champions within the administrative level to look at what are the plants that are going into city parks, and how can we have a couple of parks that have this, essentially we have operating agreements with the city of Vancouver for environmental education. So we're seen as learning gardens. So we're kind of a hybrid. We're not a community garden where people have individual plots, but we are these city full access public parks that grow artist materials or materials for traditional hand use, and are kind of tasked with finding ways to connect people to those plants and learning those skills and learning about tending those plants together. So it really becomes this bigger picture of how we rethink what city parks are for, beyond being this pretty backdrop for your personal picnics and your Instagram photos. Yeah, so
I had a question for you that I sent you
yeah.
yesterday, and you basically have answered it in a lot of ways. Is like, how could artists and craft people be really great bridges between our greater culture and problem solving ecological issues? And I know that, like, from a conceptual art perspective, that means one thing, like planting
Yeah.
ideas in people's heads, but then from a craft perspective, there's this other hands-on element. And yeah, I guess, what do you have anything else to say about that? Because I find that fascinating. And
No, I don't even engage in the whole art versus craft. Like, I just don't care. That's just, to me, others can put whatever labels on that they want. I refer to myself as a community engaged environmental artist.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, vague enough, but it also, so it's much more kind of a social practice is, I think, the core piece in that. And
well, from either place,
yeah,
or both, or all of it hybrid. I think that the division is kind of dissolving in a lot of ways right now. I think
yeah. And this is the thing about being an artist, is that you define your own practice, and you can put your own labels on whatever you want, but you define what works for you and how you want to work. So if you want to call yourself an artist, great. If you want to call yourself a craftsperson, fantastic. Whatever label fits. I identify more with gardeners than I do with artists. I identify more with people that are in the ancestral skills community than I do with artists. Like I actually, when I introduced myself, like the remember the days when we'd go to cocktail parties? So that kind of, when you'd introduce yourself to someone and you'd say you're an artist, and they'd be like, oh, so am I. What I'm a painter. And I just have this I have this inward kind of cringe of like, oh shit, how do I unpack what it is I do and recognize that somebody that identifies themselves as an artist could very, very well be just worlds removed from where I am situated. In the work I do, I find a much closer proximity for the most part with people that are, homesteaders, or, I'm a fermenting artist, whatever, like whatever. But that notion of, how do we be human? How do we make and take care of ourselves with what we have around us? I think that is kind of where I've settled myself for what really gets me out of bed in the morning and keeps me going forward, is more of this notion of, how do we take care of ourselves and each other with what we've got in our own environment? And for me, that means looking at these two pieces of land and the plants within them that I have ended up being the tender of.
Yeah, I find, like, no matter creative people in general, have the capacity to stretch beyond, often anyways,
Yeah.
beyond like labels or boundaries that are already there. Like, these are people that can connect things that seem like they would be two different things together and somehow
Yep.
make it work.
Yep.
And I think people say, like, oh, like, you'll never make a living as an artist, you can't fit into the system. Well, that's kind of a good thing, because the system that we're supposed to be fitting into is problematic in so many ways, and so artists
Yeah.
are disruptors of that in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And when it
Yeah.
comes to people who are creative, whether artists, crafts, whoever, however you want to label yourself, like have this capacity to change it from the inside out or something, you know, in whatever way their gift is. And so I think then the more of those people, however they do it in the world, the better. You know, like that's, it almost feels like a spider web model to me of like, and for what you're doing too, of
Yeah.
taking this thing and that thing and this thing and putting it together, and it kind of like sparks
Yeah.
something, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, um, I kind of thought of myself from the perspective of realizing it's like I'm getting to have the education I wish I could have had as a child. I'm doing those things now as an adult, and I'm taking others along on that journey with me. And I, you know, like, wow, what an amazing thing to be able to do. But I'm really, um, I teach from the perspective generally, you know, and it's like I've been doing this for 20 years now. So yeah, actually, I do know how to do some things. I have learned some things in that time. And I am surprised when I find that I actually am an expert at certain things. But for the most part, what I'm really interested in is being able to ask good questions and learn new things from posing those questions with others and having a group of people that come together to figure out how to answer those questions. You know, like I don't know, was the Soil to Sky project in the book, or did that happen after?
I feel like I
I
can't
can't
remember if I
remember if
saw
it
it
was
in
in
here
there.
or I saw it on your web, the Earth Hand
Okay. So
page.
that to me was a project that ended up being much smaller than we'd initially hoped because we didn't get the funding that we had hoped for, but it's still for me is just such a beautiful, beautiful way of summing up what we do, where myself and Rebecca Graham, that was working with me through Earth Hand Gleaners at the time, kind of posed the question, like, how could we make a kite from materials we are growing and gathering ourselves from the ground? And so we partnered with the BC Kite Flyers Association, which is a nonprofit in town that is normally they get together and they are like putting on kite flying festivals and traveling around flying kites, and they build their own kites. And so they understand the dynamics of the kite and what a high functioning kite needs to be. And so we started with them of what a high functioning kite needs to be and all the kind of core components of it. And then we broke that down. So we grew the flax and we spun it into kite line. And, you know, we had to Navajo ply, 3-ply that line so that it was like test weight of like 200-300 pounds. And then we dyed it with coreopsis just because that was fun. And we had a local paper maker that worked with us, taking various fibers from the garden and making paper, and that happening. One of the kite makers working with us taught us how to split bamboo fine enough that we could be making the bamboo frames, what to use for glue. That was the one that ended up being the hardest and the most kind of from afar. We had to go to Langley, which is, I don't know, like 40 kilometers south or something, for rawhide. So we used a rawhide glue because the other glues that we were trying to make were too heavy and not tacky enough. And pine pitch, for instance, we were trying to use pine pitch as one of the base materials. So it was this great opportunity of having paper makers and spinners and woodworkers and fiber artists and all of these people, and then gardeners and children's educators all kind of come together and learn all of these skills as kind of a small closed cohort of about 10 people being paid a stipend to work with us in learning all these skills. And then we went to various festivals and did one of the skills at a festival. So maybe we were paper making at a garden festival and demonstrating spinning at another harvest festival, and engaging people in the different steps of that, and making these kites that we did fly at the end of the series. And so at the end of the day, it's not really about the kite being in the air. It's about those people having the time and the space to come together and to meet each other and to exchange stories, to develop some common ground and build relationships with one another, and to just have that time with their hands busy making together and learning new things, and then seeing where they can take that into their own practice. And yeah, it was a beautiful thing. And so, taking on that kind of research project requires a lot of energy to organize, to plan, to, the conceptualization, to the writing and the budgeting and the finding the funding and all of those pieces just to bring those people to the room. That it requires dedicated, creative individuals that can take the time and the space to make that happen. And so when we get to do that, that's just brilliant. That's super exciting. And at the end of the day, it's not really about the kite that got into the air, but it's super cool that we did get the kite into the air.
It's about what all those people are going to do now with that, with the connections with each other and those processes,
Yeah, and new ways of looking at common materials, new ways about, for the kite makers, I think it blew them away. They thought we were really kind of just crazy as hell when we first approached them with the idea. They were like, who are these people? You guys are weird. But, kite flyers are weird too. So we actually fit really well together. We found that it was good. It was a very simpatico weirdness for kind of, yeah. So yeah, bringing together quirky, nerdy people that can share their passion and find that common ground and just lift everybody up, right?
Yeah.
It's good work.
Hearing you talk about flax and paper and like material, making things all from like materials from the land is reminding me of spending time with Jim Croft. I've probably mentioned you to him.
I've listened to your podcasts with him. Yes.
He's funny.
Yeah.
Or mentioned him to you. And
Yeah.
there's so much more. I have a lot of recordings of him talking about flax and hemp and stuff too. But
Yeah.
Just his perspective and way of doing things, it's almost like that's his default alongside gleaning,
Yeah.
So it's like about traditional ways of doing things intermingled in this post-apocalyptic thing. And
yeah.
I feel like
Have you done an interview with Mary ever?
Melody, his partner Melody.
His partner Melody. Have you done an interview with her?
I haven't. I asked her and she's like, I don't know. She's kind of not sure. But although her kids are like, you really should interview her. I think that I don't know what. Maybe at some point she'll be interested in it. But at least the past 2 years when I've spent time there, I didn't go there this summer, but she's been like, maybe, I don't know. And she's always really busy too when I'm there, because if I'm there in their classes, she's just like swamped. So she's also really interesting the way she does things, and she's less in the spotlight as Jim, but she's just as talented,
Yeah, that's my sense. Well, you could let her know that there's been a request.
There's been a few people who've like, you're from Melody, I'm like, all right, I'll have to convince her without being too forceful about it too.
Right. Yeah.
She's like, what is this podcast thing you're doing? Like, so, she has some beautiful stories too, and like her relationship with the plants too is really amazing. And yeah, she has taken some class. She took a class with Margaret Mathewson years ago. That was like the only class she really ever took, and then she's like spent a lot of time just like teaching herself how to work with all these different materials, and so and the way they live and the world they live in, it's kind of aside from the modern world in a lot of senses. Like they're not tapped into that like stream of the collective consciousness of all the news, and aside from video,
Yeah.
So they just make time in their lives that it's all about that, and then other things come,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really cool. But well,
you wanted to ask me about flax and nettle.
Yes, and you spoke a little bit about nettles, about planting it, and growing it and that kind of thing. But yeah, maybe you could like.
Yeah, so I started growing. My friend Penny Copeland is a spinner and a weaver and a dyer, and has done it all. And she had come to me 5-6 years ago, and she was like, you know, this environment is perfect for growing flax. If you want to be looking at sustainable cloth and fiber and that piece, we could look at getting a little flax crop together. So she actually wrote a little grant, got like, I think it was $1,000 or something, to be able to hire a friend to build our flax processing equipment. And he made that equipment, and she tracked down seeds, and we did this little plot, and that kind of started this whole flax process for us. And, you know, I've been reading various books. You know, flax is seen as being one of our founding agricultural crops. I've read anywhere from 9 to 12,000 years that humans have been actively growing as an agricultural crop, flax, for both, you know, seed and cloth. And I've recently just kind of been thinking about the fact that this notion that we haven't necessarily domesticated flax, but that perhaps flax has domesticated us, you know, that we are the ones that, you know, that plant needs us to put it in the ground at kind of the 100th day of the year, and that it's another 100 days until we harvest. And there's this kind of rhythm that's linked into the humans doing the work to make the flax possible, relative to nettle as this perennial plant that just keeps coming back and has got, again, a thousands and thousands of years history of clothing people all over the northern hemisphere. There's versions of stinging nettle that grow, and it has kind of defied domestication, and I think there have been probably some attempts. It's a much more challenging to process than flax for, to my sense, 2 reasons. One is that it's got a gum that doesn't exist on either hemp or flax, the other 2 main bast fibers. It's got a gum that's harder to ret and take away. It's also a hollow tube, which means it doesn't kind of like, you can't smash it and extract fibers the way you can with flax and a flax break. So it's a little more nuanced and hands-on. And of course it stings, so it's probably a lot harder to just motivate a workforce to be harvesting it. But there's something there of where, you know, I've read, I think is it Jeanette Armstrong or Robin Wall Kimmerer, that talk about nettle's sting as being the plant telling you to take notice. It's like the plant is telling you, like, I'm here, pay attention to me. And that, you know, nettle is this very kind of fierce plant up front. It feels a little wild, and it's got that kind of fierceness because of that edge that's intimidating, versus flax, which is this very gentle, beautiful plant to look at, and it's very soft on the hand. It's very strong, but it's also very compliant, and it kind of processes into this beautiful blonde strix so beautifully and easily relative to nettle. And yeah, so I go back and forth between working with flax and working with nettle. And my learnings about both fibers have really been impacted from the capacity to go from one plant to the other. And what I learn in processing with one, I can apply to the other. And I kind of feel like maybe someday when I retire, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a story about the 3 sisters, flax, hemp, and nettle. And of course, they all are medicine, and they're all fiber. And one is the good sister that does what she's told, that of course has this beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes. And then there is the wild sister, the party sister, who is the one that's just always kind of in trouble with the law and has kind of had a challenging history and is being misunderstood, getting herself in trouble. And then nettle is the wild sister that's the outsider, that doesn't want to live with the community, that kind of lives in the forest, outside of where the pack is, and scares a lot of people. are intimidated by her, but when you get close, you realize that she's got everything you need and has got so much to share and is really taking care of the other plants and other people that are around her in what she's feeding them and offering them. So there's a story there. There's a fable that probably already exists, but I haven't found it yet. But I love this notion of these 3 fiber plants that humans have got this long ingrained relationship or different relationships with. And nettle for me is my medicine in many ways. I was really really touched when I read in Ireland a few years back. I was in a museum that had this beautiful didactic display on clothing, ancient clothing in Ireland, and they talked the 4 main fibers that people would have been wearing in Ireland 10,000 years ago were nettle, flax, and dog hair and wolf hair were the 4 fibers. And, you know, I live in a place that is where stinging nettle was used for fishnets, where stinging nettle would have been used for clothing people. And so it's this, nettle is the bridge, it's the cultural medicine, and it's the bridge for me that links my own ancestors to this place and links me to this place, and is the shared commonality I have with the people who are from this place that also have that shared connection to stinging nettle in their own ancestry and their own history. So it, yeah, it feels like the more I can learn about nettle, the more I can work with nettle and be sharing that with others, because again, it's a plant that across the Northern Hemisphere has been used and has been appreciated and celebrated. And the stories that do exist that have been written about nettle, the songs, the poems, you know, there's so much out there that speaks to a long entrenched understanding and awareness of nettle that has been kind of lost for the most part. It's yeah, as Tracy would say, it's sleeping knowledge, and we're just waking that up. So every year I learn more from nettle. It continues to surprise. She is a strong and powerful teacher that is great for my arthritis, is good for my soul. Time with the plant is always good. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I could go on about nettle forever, but I think the big thing is when I can be learning about nettle and then taking that to different communities and sharing what I'm learning about nettle with other people, to kind of just not have the plant be demonized and have it be something that people recognize, like, oh yeah, nettle, she stings, be careful, walk around, give her respect that she deserves, but don't pull it. Leave it. The bees need it. The other plants need it. The ladybugs, all that, you know, it's doing its thing, and it's giving us medicine. It's giving us fiber. It's giving us tea. There's so much there if we have respect for her.
I've pushed my dad's edge with nettles. He's a horticulturalist, and my grandmother was a horticulturalist. So he's like homesteading now and not running a business selling plants anymore. But I would, when I lived out east more, I would bring plants to his land a lot. Like, be like, you should plant this here, you know. And I did bring nettles one time. He was like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Oh Lord," that's how he would say it. "You want me to plant this? It's gonna take over. It stings." I'm like, "But it's good," you know. He did plant it because he wanted to make me happy, so he planted it, and now it's like in this creek area, and it's kind of taken on its own.
Yeah.
It was just, yeah, it was interesting to interface with that, like from his
Yeah.
horticultural background.
No kidding. Yeah, it's you know, I was asked to give a talk last year about stinging nettle to a group of master gardeners. And so that was interesting because most of them, you know, what did I talk about? Why plants deserve place in our gardens, deserve space in our gardens. And so it was nettle, daylily, and Himalayan blackberry, to just talk about what are some other ways of thinking about these species that people are either just otherwise dismissive of. And yeah, it was interesting getting people on board with nettle. But one of the terms I heard years back that has really stuck with me is that it was the clothing of the landless.
Mm.
And that resonates as somebody who lives in the downtown east side, will never own property in this city, will never own property probably ever, but that notion that if you were attached to land, whether you were tending somebody else's land, whether you were the owner of the land, you likely were wearing linen and wool, but like linen would be your baseline. And it was the people who didn't have access to land for that spring planting and summer harvesting, et cetera, that would be, the travelers, the Roma, whomever, that would be gathering nettles in their journey. And so there's something there for me also that kind of fits. Yeah, anyway, it's, yeah.
Yeah. Jim has
Love the nettle.
Yeah, and Jim has talked a lot to me about flax and hemp, and there being this class divide, with hemp being for the lowly people or whatever, and
Yeah,
flax being this fine thing. But he also talked about, and I don't remember if it was in the interview on the podcast, but how sometimes hemp was even labeled as linen flax, but when it was actually hemp, just because people had this conception of hemp as
right.
like for the low class or whatever. So a lot of people are wearing hemp and think they're wearing something else. But
Yeah, I had this interesting little epiphany earlier this spring. So I've been working on making a nettle shirt and processing a lot of nettle and spinning a lot of nettle. And I've spun a lot of flax and made a couple of shirts with local linen that I've grown. And so the thing with linen is it ends up being separate grades. You have your line linen, which are your long fiber, and then you have the shorter, what's left in the hackles, which is called tow, T-O-W. And the tow is also used, some of it would be made into paper for currency, or, various products that are made with it. But a lot of it would still be spun and was the clothing that poor people that were working others' lands, slaves, those that were not having the money for the good quality linen were wearing this tow. And tow is itchy, it's scratchy, it's not nice on the skin. Nettle has the same quality where you end up with your line nettle and you've got your shorter nettle fiber, the tow. The tow from nettle is silky and soft. And I had this moment of recognizing, like, holy shit, both of these fibers go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years in humanity's process. At some point, there were decisions being made to, take flax into a more industrial model and a more consumer regular model, whereas nettle was left on the side. And it would have likely been known that nettle had a softer product in the byproduct than linen and then flax. And even at that point, it would have been that the lower classes or the working poor or the poor people and what their needs were or what their physical requirements were being dismissed because the flax was easier to process. And that, right? Yeah. Anyway, that's just me making stuff up, right? That's just me kind of making up my own little conspiracy about what went down thousands of years ago. But it feels completely possible that there were various decisions made at various points a long time ago, recognizing linen was easier and cheaper to process, even though the product that was created for the working poor or the poorer class was far inferior to the nettle, and that was dismissed out of hand as not mattering.
wow.
Yeah. So here we are. Things have changed so much, haven't they? Sorry. Yeah. It just went dark there.
Okay. So good. Well, before we wrap this up, if people want to glean or like experiment wherever they are, do you have any kind of advice for how people can be creative in that way?
Oh, just really look at what is the excess that is around that has maybe been dismissed. And I have a couple of little kind of hand tests that I like to do when I'm meeting somebody new on the land. If you can take a fiber and wrap it around your all four fingers and not pull your fingers apart, then the fiber has strength. If you can twist it around a finger, an individual finger, without it fraying, then it's got capacity for twist. And so just even being able to, pull a blade of grass or a dried stalk of an unknown plant or a leaf of an unknown plant and see how it responds to some twist, and recognize if it's not doing anything that seems useful. Try it at a different season. Recognize there is a season for everything. So some things you just can't harvest in June. It's like their time isn't going to be till October or November. So having that awareness of what's in your environment and what is abundant and what is the plant giving up? What are the things that daylily is something I always encourage when I hear teachers wanting to get students working with plants. I tell them to put daylilies in because it's a plant that's really drought tolerant. And come September, when school starts, all of those green leaves are starting to golden, and you can just give them a gentle tug and the leaves release without any tools. So you can have a group of children that are pulling plants without having to hand them all sharp tools, and you've got immediate material that is ready for a really quick soak, and you can be teaching rope making without having any other tools required. So looking at what are the plants, if that doesn't fit for your environment, what are the other species that are kind of like that, and what are the plants that belong where you live, and are you finding them? Can you seed save from them and plant more of them? So that you're not having that hard challenge of getting into, have other people harvested here before me already? Am I taking 10%? Am I taking 30%? Have somebody already taken 70%? If you've got a particular area, just, cracks in sidewalks, plant seeds. Yeah.
Cool. Where can people find you online? It seems like you have a few different zones.
So Instagram, my website is useless. It was hacked. I don't think I've put anything on it in 3 or 4 years, and anyway, so my Instagram is just Sharon Kallis, and the nonprofit that I started is called Earth Hand Gleaners Society, and our website is maintained, and I send out a newsletter once a month. So if people just kind of want to stay in touch, pretty much everything now is on Zoom. So there's lots of Zoom classes and options that will keep happening through Zoom. So yeah, that's probably earthhand.com and Sharon Kallis on Instagram.
Well, thanks for being on the podcast. Finally, I know I wanted to try to do it in person last year, but I'm like, okay, it's been in the back of my head. I'm like, and I just appreciate what you're doing, and I've just been really wanting to talk to you.
Well, thanks for reaching out, Kelly. Nice to see your face through the internet. Someday we'll get to do this in person.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, or at least hang out again in person. It's gonna be wonderful when that finally can happen. So.
Yeah. Yes.
Just like with
well, you stay safe.
You too. Okay.
All right. Take care. Bye.
This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.